The squad car's headlights cut through the darkness as officers Steve Martinez and Brian Thompson patrol the streets of Eastwood District. The digital clock on the dashboard reads 11:43 p.m. Steam rises from their coffee cups while they drive past closed storefronts and dimly lit apartment buildings. "Another shooting yesterday," Steve says, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Third one this month in this neighborhood." His jaw clenches as he scans the streets, his 8 years on the force evident in his watchful gaze. Brian shifts in the passenger seat, his rookie status showing in his uncertain movements. The captain says crime rates are actually down compared to last year. He checks his phone briefly, scrolling through recent crime statistics. "Statistics don't tell the whole story," Steve responds sharply. "You haven't been here long enough. This place changes you." He turns down Mason Street, where broken streetlights create patches of darkness. The park comes into view, Henderson Memorial Park, known locally as a trouble spot after dark. The basketball courts stand empty, and the children's playground equipment casts long shadows under the moonlight. That's when they spot him. A man stands alone near the park bench, his attention focused on his phone screen. The blue light illuminates his face in the darkness. He wears a dark jacket and jeans, nothing particularly suspicious, but Steve's shoulders tense immediately. "Look at him," Steve mutters, slowing the patrol car. Nobody's just checking their phone in a park at this hour. His hand moves instinctively toward his holster. Brian hesitates, studying the situation. The man hasn't done anything wrong, but years of training and Steve's influence weigh heavily on his decision-making. "Should we check it out?" Without waiting for further discussion, Steve parks the car. The cruiser's lights remain off as they exit the vehicle. Steve takes the lead, his hand resting on his weapon. The man, now identified as Elijah, looks up from his phone, noticing their approach. "Police, hands where we can see them." Steve's voice booms across the empty park. The command echoes off nearby buildings, startling a group of pigeons into flight. Elijah raises his hands slowly, his phone still clutched in one palm. "Officers, I can explain," he begins, his voice steady despite the situation. "Drop the phone, now." Steve advances, his stance aggressive. Brian follows, weapon drawn but pointed downward, caught between protocol and a growing sense of unease. "I'm here for work," Elijah tries to explain, maintaining his composure. "If you'll just let me show you my—" "On your knees!" Steve closes the distance rapidly, leaving no room for explanation. The situation escalates in seconds, the peaceful night shattered by shouted commands and rising tension. Brian watches the scene unfold, his finger resting near his weapon's trigger. Training tells him to trust his partner, but something about this situation feels wrong. The man's calm demeanor doesn't match their assumptions, but momentum carries them forward into what will become a life-changing confrontation for everyone involved. 14-year-old Steve Martinez sits on his front porch, watching police sirens illuminate the night. His father, a construction worker, places a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Remember, son," he says in a gruff voice, "in this neighborhood, you trust your gut or you don't make it." The memory flashes through Steve's mind as he tightens his grip on Elijah's arm. 1992. Steve's family apartment gets broken into 3 times, each time the police arrive too late. His mother installs another lock, his father buys a baseball bat, and young Steve learns to see threats everywhere. The last break-in ends with his father in the hospital, a confrontation gone wrong. The perpetrator was never caught. These fragments of memory fuel Steve's actions now, decades later, as he forces Elijah to the ground. Each movement is driven by years of accumulated fear disguised as authority. Meanwhile, Brian's thoughts drift to his mother's kitchen 6 years earlier. The smell of coffee and her worried expression as she watched him try on his police academy uniform for the first time. "Baby," she had said, stirring her coffee endlessly. "You know what they do to people who look like us. Are you sure about this?" Brian, the son of a black mother and white father, straddles two worlds uncomfortably. His mother shared stories of police harassment, while his father spoke of duty and service. Now, watching Steve's aggressive handling of Elijah, these conflicting narratives clash in his mind. The confrontation intensifies. Elijah's phone clatters to the ground as Steve forces his arms behind his back. "Stop resisting," Steve shouts, though Elijah remains compliant. Brian notices this disconnect but stays in position, following procedure while doubt gnaws at him. "I have identification," Elijah manages to say, his face pressed against the cold pavement. His words are measured, controlled, but Steve interprets the calmness as defiance. The situation spirals. Steve's knee presses into Elijah's back, harder than necessary. Training gives way to instinct, the same instinct his father praised, the one forged in years of neighborhood violence. Brian steps forward, sensing the excessive force, but hesitates. "He's not resisting," Brian finally speaks up, his voice barely carrying over the sound of Elijah's labored breathing. Steve doesn't hear him, or chooses not to. His hands shake slightly as he secures the handcuffs, too tight. Elijah winces but remains silent, his eyes focused on something in the distance. What neither officer notices are the subtle movements in the shadows nearby. Dark figures observe the scene, recording every moment. Among them, FBI agents watch their colleague endure the assault, gathering evidence for what will become a pivotal investigation. The confrontation ends with Elijah on his feet, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead where it hit the pavement. Steve and Brian retreat to their patrol car, filing a routine report about a suspicious person who resisted questioning. As they drive away, Brian glances in the rearview mirror. Elijah stands eerily still in the park's fluorescent lighting, his FBI badge now visible in his hand, watching their departure with an unreadable expression. Neither officer realizes they've just set in motion events that will unravel not only their careers, but the entire department's foundation of corruption and prejudice. The FBI surveillance van parked 3 blocks away buzzes with activity. Agent Sarah Chen slams her fist against the monitoring equipment. "They just assaulted a federal agent," she says through gritted teeth, rewinding the high-definition footage of the incident. Elijah walks into the van 10 minutes later, pressing a tissue against his forehead. The cut isn't deep, but the implications of what just happened run far deeper than his physical injuries. His team watches him with a mixture of anger and concern. "You okay?" Chen asks, though she can see he's not. Elijah nods, maintaining his professional composure even now. He removes his jacket, revealing the wire he wore during the encounter. Standard procedure for their ongoing investigation into police corruption. "Get me Deputy Director Matthews," Elijah says, his voice steady despite the evening's events. What just happened changes everything. He reviews his phone, the same one Steve and Brian thought was suspicious. On it, encrypted messages detail a complex network of corruption they've been tracking for months. Within hours, the FBI's Civil Rights Division launches a formal investigation. The incident report filed by Steve and Brian already shows discrepancies with the surveillance footage. Their account of a resistant suspect contrasts sharply with video showing Elijah's complete compliance. At police headquarters, Captain James Morrison receives the first notification at 6 a.m. His face pales as he reads the FBI letterhead. "Jesus Christ," he mutters, immediately calling an emergency meeting with Internal Affairs. The community responds swiftly. By morning, social media explodes with shaky cell phone footage of the incident captured by nearby residents. Local activists organize protests outside the precinct. News vans line up along the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray morning sky. Steve and Brian arrive for their shift, unaware of the storm brewing. The station feels different. Colleagues avoid eye contact. Conversations stop when they enter rooms. It's only when they're called into the captain's office that reality begins to sink in. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Morrison asks, dropping a thick folder on his desk. "The man you assaulted last night is FBI Special Agent Elijah Washington. He's been leading an ongoing federal investigation." The words hit like physical blows. Brian sits heavily in his chair, while Steve remains standing defensive. "He was suspicious," Steve begins, but Morrison cuts him off. "Save it for internal affairs," the captain snaps. "They're on their way, and the FBI wants to talk to both of you." He looks older suddenly, worn down by the weight of what's coming. Outside the station, protesters gather. Their chants echo through the building's walls. No justice, no peace. Signs bearing Elijah's photo, his FBI credentials clearly visible, wave above the crowd. The investigation expands rapidly. FBI agents seize records, interview officers, and review years of complaint files. What started as a brutal but routine stop begins to unravel something much larger, a pattern of behavior that can no longer be ignored. Elijah, now working openly from the FBI field office, examines the growing evidence wall. Photos, documents, and connection maps cover the surface. Steve and Brian's faces are just two among many, but their actions have inadvertently provided the key to a much larger investigation. The precinct's conference room fills with tense silence. Deputy chiefs, sergeants, and internal affairs investigators crowd around the long table, watching surveillance footage of the incident play out on a large screen. The image freezes on Steve's face, contorted with anger as he forces Elijah to the ground. Captain Morrison addresses the room, his voice strained. "We're facing potential civil rights violations, excessive force charges, and a federal investigation that could tear this department apart." He clicks through photographs documenting Elijah's injuries. "Our own officers assaulted a federal agent who was conducting a legitimate investigation." Internal Affairs. Lieutenant Garcia interjects, reading from a thick file. "Officer Martinez has 6 prior complaints of excessive force, all involving minority suspects. Officer Thompson, despite being newer, has 2 incidents marked as concerning." The statistics paint a damaging picture of systemic issues. Meanwhile, Brian sits alone in his apartment, ignoring calls from family and friends. His phone buzzes constantly with text messages, including one from Marcus, his childhood friend. "Need to talk to you. This isn't you, man. What happened to the kid who wanted to change things?" The message hits hard. Brian remembers their shared dreams of bridging the gap between police and community. Now, his uniform feels like a weight pulling him under. He finally replies, "Tomorrow, the usual spot." The next morning, at a small coffee shop away from the precinct, Marcus doesn't hold back. "You stood there and watched it happen," he says, pushing his untouched coffee aside. "You became exactly what your mama warned you about." Brian struggles to defend himself. "You don't understand the pressure, the split-second decisions." "No," Marcus cuts him off. "My cousin got beaten by cops last year. You said it was probably justified. Now look at you, doing the same thing." The words hang between them, decades of friendship straining under the weight of reality. Across town, Steve sits in his car outside his father's old house. The neighborhood hasn't changed much. Still rough, still suspicious of outsiders. He watches children play basketball in the same street where he learned to fear the world. His phone contains dozens of missed calls from the police union representative, but Steve's thoughts are elsewhere. He remembers every face of every person he's stopped, searched, or arrested. How many times had he seen threat where there was none? How many Elijahs came before this one? A knock on his car window startles him. It's Mrs. Rodriguez, his old neighbor. "I saw you on the news," she says in Spanish. "You used to play with my Carlos. Now you're out there doing the same things they did to him." She walks away before he can respond, leaving Steve with the memory of Carlos's arrest years ago, an arrest Steve had defended at the time. Back at the precinct, psychological evaluations are scheduled. The department scrambles to implement emergency sensitivity training. But the damage control feels hollow, a band-aid on a bullet wound. In the break room, other officers debate taking sides. Some defend the old ways, citing danger and split-second decisions. Others, mostly younger officers, push for change. The division grows deeper with each passing hour. Steve and Brian's lockers become unofficial markers of the department's split. Some officers leave notes of support. Others turn away in disgust. The thin blue line, once so clear, begins to blur and fracture. In a dimly lit office at the FBI field headquarters, Elijah studies surveillance photos spread across his desk. The images show Marcus Santiago, the city's most elusive drug trafficker, meeting with various figures, some in business suits, others in police uniforms. The bruises on Elijah's face have faded, but the incident has inadvertently pushed his investigation into overdrive. Santiago's operation isn't just about drugs, Elijah explains to his task force. He's built a network of corruption that reaches into every level of city government. He pins new photos to the evidence board, wire transfers, property deeds, and surveillance shots showing police cruisers making regular visits to known drug houses. Agent Chen interrupts with urgent news. "We've got movement. Santiago's calling a meeting tonight at the abandoned Maxwell factory." She hands Elijah a transcript of an intercepted phone call. "He's spooked by all the federal attention after your incident." Elijah prepares for his most dangerous undercover operation yet. In a secure room, he transforms into Marcus James, a mid-level drug dealer from Atlanta, looking to expand his territory. The transformation is more than just clothes and a fake ID. It's a complete immersion into a different world. At the Maxwell factory, Elijah navigates through Santiago's security measures. The building's interior is a maze of old machinery and new surveillance equipment. He notices several familiar faces, including officers he's seen at the precinct where Steve and Brian work. During the meeting, Santiago reveals his paranoia. "We've got feds crawling all over the city," he says, pacing nervously. "Someone's talking, and when I find out who..." The threat hangs in the air like smoke. An informant pulls Elijah aside afterward, speaking in hushed tones. "It's worse than you think," the informant whispers. "Santiago's got half the force in his pocket. That incident with those cops? It wasn't random. They're known for handling Santiago's problems." The revelation hits Elijah hard. Steve and Brian's actions might not just be about racial profiling. They could be part of a larger pattern of corrupt officers maintaining control of certain neighborhoods for Santiago's operation. Back at his undercover apartment, Elijah carefully documents everything. His hands shake slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he's uncovering. The corruption runs deeper than anyone suspected, and the racial tensions in the city have provided perfect cover for Santiago's operation. Meanwhile, Brian's crisis of conscience deepens. He begins noticing subtle patterns in his unit's patrol routes. Certain areas always avoided, others subject to excessive surveillance. The pieces start fitting together, forming a picture he's afraid to acknowledge. Elijah receives a warning from another informant. Santiago's people are watching him. His cover story is holding, but the scrutiny is intense. Every move he makes is monitored, every word analyzed. One wrong step could expose not just him, but years of investigative work. The stakes rise when Elijah discovers documents linking Santiago's operation to several suspicious deaths, including witnesses who were about to testify in corruption cases. These deaths were ruled accidents or random crime, all investigated by the same group of officers. Protesters fill the streets outside the police precinct, their numbers growing daily. Signs bearing Elijah's bruised face alongside other victims of police brutality, create a sea of painful reminders. Local news vans broadcast live as community leaders demand accountability, their speeches echoing through megaphones. "No more business as usual," Reverend Jackson's voice booms across the crowd. "We demand a complete investigation of every officer involved." The crowd responds with thunderous approval, their chants growing louder with each passing hour. Inside the precinct, Steve and Brian face increasing isolation. The break room falls silent when they enter. Former friends suddenly have paperwork to do, meetings to attend. The wall of solidarity they once relied on crumbles around them. Steve sits alone at his desk, reviewing body cam footage from past arrests. Each interaction he watches reveals patterns he'd previously justified: the quick escalation, the assumption of guilt, the unnecessary force. His hands shake as he closes another video file. In the locker room, a senior officer corners Brian. "Keep your mouth shut," he warns. "This whole thing will blow over if everyone sticks together." The implied threat in his voice makes Brian's stomach turn. He recognizes the officer as one who frequently patrols areas known for Santiago's activities. During a mandatory department meeting, Brian finally breaks his silence. "Maybe they're right," he says, his voice cutting through the tension. "Maybe we need to look at how we're doing things." The room erupts in heated arguments, divisions becoming more apparent. Steve watches his partner's outburst with conflicting emotions. Part of him wants to maintain the status quo, to believe in the righteousness of their actions. But doubt creeps in like a slow poison, eating away at his certainties. Later that night, in Steve's apartment, the partners face each other across a kitchen table, cluttered with incident reports and newspaper clippings. Brian speaks first, his voice heavy with emotion. "We were wrong, Steve. Not just about Elijah, about everything." He pushes forward a stack of civilian complaints they'd dismissed over the years. "Look at the pattern. Really look at it." Steve's defensive walls begin to crack. "My old man always said, trust your instincts," he says, but his voice lacks conviction. "But maybe our instincts are part of the problem." Outside, protesters march with candles, their light casting dancing shadows through Steve's window. The chants become a backdrop to their conversation about prejudice, fear, and the possibility of change. Meanwhile, Elijah continues his undercover work, now aware that his assault has become a catalyst for something larger. Every protest, every news story, every internal department conflict creates pressure on Santiago's network of corrupt officers. The city feels like a powder keg, with Steve and Brian caught between old loyalties and emerging truths. Their actions have sparked a movement that threatens to expose not just their own prejudices, but an entire system of corruption and abuse. The community center auditorium fills beyond capacity. Metal folding chairs scrape against linoleum floors as people squeeze into every available space. The air conditioning struggles against the heat of hundreds of bodies and rising tensions. At home, Steve adjusts his tie for the third time. His dress uniform, usually a source of pride, feels like armor he's not sure he deserves to wear. The morning paper lies on his kitchen counter, its headline screaming, "Community demands answers. Police, brutality, or corruption." Across town, Brian sits in his car outside the community center, watching families arrive. He recognizes faces from the neighborhood, people he's sworn to protect, but has perhaps helped alienate. His phone buzzes with a message from Internal Affairs. "Remember, no comments about the ongoing investigation." Elijah prepares differently. In a secure FBI office, he reviews his role for the evening. "Just another concerned citizen," his supervisor reminds him. "We can't risk exposing the larger investigation." His bruises have healed, but he carefully applies makeup to enhance them. A visual reminder of why they're all here. Inside the auditorium, the police chief takes the podium first. His prepared statement about ongoing investigations and department policies is drowned out by shouts from the crowd. Community leaders demand specifics about reform, about accountability. Mrs. Washington, an elderly resident, stands to speak. "I've lived here 40 years, she says, her voice trembling. "I used to tell my grandchildren the police were here to help. What am I supposed to tell them now?" Her words cut through the noise, leaving painful silence. Steve and Brian sit with other officers along the wall, their presence required but unwelcome. Each testimony feels like an indictment. A teenager describes being harassed on his way to school. A business owner talks about arbitrary searches of his store. A nurse recounts treating victims of police violence who were too afraid to file complaints. The tension peaks when Marcus, Brian's childhood friend, takes the microphone. "Some of us thought having officers who looked like us would change things," he says, staring directly at Brian. "But the system changes them instead." The words hang in the air like smoke. Elijah observes from the middle rows, noting which officers shift uncomfortably at specific accusations. His trained eye catches subtle exchanges between certain officers and known associates of Santiago. Even here, the web of corruption reveals itself in tiny gestures. A young activist demands Steve and Brian's immediate firing. The crowd erupts in agreement. The police chief tries to restore order, citing due process, but his words only fuel the anger. Someone shouts about the department protecting its own. Brian stands suddenly, moving toward the podium. Steve grabs his arm, whispering, "What are you doing?" But Brian pulls away. The room falls silent as he reaches for the microphone, every eye watching, every phone recording. Before he can speak, a commotion erupts at the back of the room. Two officers involved in Santiago's operation are trying to remove a vocal protester. The situation threatens to spiral into exactly the kind of confrontation everyone fears. The meeting dissolves into chaos, with private security trying to maintain order while smartphone cameras capture everything. Outside, more protesters gather, drawn by social media updates about the tension inside. The chaos at the community center reaches its peak when Elijah rises from his seat. His movement is deliberate, calculated, yet carries an air of spontaneity. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows as he makes his way to the podium, pulling out his FBI credentials. "My name is Special Agent Elijah Washington." His voice cuts through the noise like a blade. The room freezes. Smartphones pivot toward him, live streaming this unexpected development to thousands. "2 weeks ago, I was assaulted by Officers Martinez and Brian while conducting a federal investigation." Steve's face drains of color. Brian grips the edge of his chair. The other officers, particularly those on Santiago's payroll, exchange worried glances. The room holds its collective breath. "But this isn't just about one incident," Elijah continues, his trained voice steady. "This is about a system that turns fear into violence, prejudice into policy." He makes eye contact with both Steve and Brian. "And sometimes, the very people we distrust are fighting battles we don't see." He begins sharing sanitized details of his work, enough to establish credibility without compromising the ongoing investigation. He describes growing up in a similar community, his decision to join the FBI, and his dedication to fighting corruption from within. "The problem isn't just about race," he explains, pacing the stage. "It's about power, corruption, and the walls we build between us." His words resonate differently with different audience members. Protesters hear acknowledgement, officers hear understanding, and corrupt cops hear warning. A community elder stands up, her voice wavering. "How can we trust any of them after what they did to you?" The question hangs heavy in the air. Elijah's response is measured. Trust isn't given. It's rebuilt, piece by piece. He turns to face the police section. It starts with acknowledging our biases, our fears, our mistakes. But it also requires understanding the pressures and complexities officers face. Steve finds himself nodding unconsciously. For the first time, He sees the situation through a different lens, not as an attack on police, but as an opportunity for change. Brian, emboldened by Elijah's words, finally reaches the podium. His voice shakes at first, but gains strength. "I was wrong," he begins, "not just that night, but many nights before it. We've been trained to see threats everywhere, but maybe the biggest threat is what that fear does to us." The room shifts. The anger doesn't disappear, but it begins to transform into something else, a cautious hope for dialogue. Even some of Santiago's officers appear affected, though their discomfort is visible. Elijah watches the subtle reactions, mentally noting which officers seem genuinely moved and which appear threatened by the direction of the conversation. His revelation serves multiple purposes. It provides a path toward healing while increasing pressure on the corrupt elements within the department. The meeting ends differently than it began. Small groups form throughout the room, officers talking with community members, sharing experiences, listening to each other. It's not resolution, but it's a start. An evidence box thuds onto Detective Sarah Chen's desk at FBI headquarters. "You need to see this," she tells Elijah, spreading out surveillance photos. They show Officer James Ramirez, Steve's longtime mentor, meeting with Santiago's lieutenants behind a closed auto shop. The investigation accelerates. Financial records reveal suspicious deposits in Ramirez's offshore accounts. Phone records show calls between him and Santiago's organization coinciding with failed drug busts. The pattern is clear, but the implications are staggering. Steve receives an anonymous envelope in his mailbox. Inside, photos of Ramirez accepting payoffs. His hands tremble as he recognizes locations, dates, times when drug shipments mysteriously disappeared from evidence. The man who taught him everything about police work, who supported him after his father's death, stands revealed as part of the corruption. "I trained you well, didn't I?" Ramirez confronts Steve in the parking garage. "You never asked questions about those special assignments, never wondered why certain areas were off limits." His friendly tone carries an undercurrent of threat. Steve feels sick, remembering all the times he'd followed Ramirez's hunches about which cars to stop, which people to search. Meanwhile, Brian's investigation leads him to Marcus, his childhood friend. Security footage shows Marcus's construction company vehicles at Santiago's warehouses. The betrayal cuts deep. While Brian struggled with his conscience, Marcus played both sides, using their friendship as cover. In the evidence room, Brian discovers years of falsified reports, traffic stops that funneled money to corrupt officers, drug busts where evidence vanished, his signature on some reports, following orders he never questioned. The weight of complicity settles on his shoulders. Elijah coordinates with internal affairs, building cases against 18 officers. Each thread connects back to Santiago, revealing a decade-long operation. Traffic stops generated bribes. Asset seizures disappeared. Witness intimidation covered everything. "They're watching us," Chen warns Elijah. "Santiago's people know we're closing in." Surveillance photos show unmarked cars following investigators. Pressure builds as more officers realize their careers hang in balance. Steve confronts Ramirez in an empty locker room. "How many?" he demands. "How many innocent people did we harass because Santiago ordered it?" Ramirez laughs coldly. "Innocent? In this job, nobody's innocent. You'll learn that when they come for you next." Brian discovers his own role in the corruption was larger than he imagined. Those routine patrols in certain neighborhoods, all orchestrated to protect Santiago's territory. The realization that his racial profiling served someone else's greed makes him physically ill. The investigation reaches higher. Captains, lieutenants, even city officials implicated. Each revelation shakes the department's foundation. Trust evaporates as officers wonder who'll be exposed next. The FBI tactical team assembles at 4 a.m., strapping on body armor in silence. Elijah checks his weapon one last time. Tonight's raid will target Santiago's operation and the corrupt officers simultaneously. Months of investigation, countless hours of surveillance, all leading to this moment. Steve sits in his car outside Ramirez's house, a wire hidden under his shirt. "Just get him talking," Elijah had instructed. His hands shake as he dials Ramirez's number. "We need to meet, now. Things are falling apart." The urgency in his voice isn't fake. Brian positions himself near Marcus's construction office, working with another FBI team. The guilt of betraying his childhood friend battles with his duty. Through his earpiece, he hears teams reporting ready positions across the city. Inside Santiago's main warehouse, a meeting is already underway. Corrupt officers gather with drug lieutenants, unaware they're surrounded. Santiago paces nervously. "Someone's talking. We need to clean house tonight." Ramirez meets Steve in an abandoned lot. "You're right. Things are falling apart," he says, reaching for what Steve knows is a concealed weapon. But before he can draw, FBI teams emerge from the shadows. Ramirez's face contorts with realization. His protege has turned on him. Simultaneously, tactical teams breach Santiago's warehouse. The resulting chaos exposes alliances as corrupt officers draw weapons to protect their drug connections. The night erupts with flashbangs and shouted commands. Marcus attempts to flee through his office's back door, only to find Brian waiting. Their eyes meet in a moment of shared history and broken trust. "I never wanted this," Marcus says, raising his hands. Brian's response is professional, hiding his personal pain as he makes the arrest. Elijah leads the main assault on Santiago himself. The drug lord barricades himself in his office, destroying evidence. When the door finally breaks down, they find him attempting to transfer millions offshore. His network of corruption, built over decades, crumbles in minutes. Evidence pours in from across the city. Recording devices hidden in patrol cars reveal years of coordinated corruption. Financial records show millions in bribes. Officers involved in the scheme begin turning on each other, hoping for leniency. The morning news broadcasts footage of dozens of arrests. Police officers led away in handcuffs. Santiago's empire dismantled. The community watches in shock as trusted figures are revealed as criminals. In the aftermath, Steve and Brian face their own hearings. Their cooperation with the FBI and willingness to expose corruption earned them suspension rather than termination. More importantly, they begin the hard work of rebuilding trust, both with themselves and their community. Elijah addresses a graduation ceremony for new police cadets months later. "Change starts with acknowledgement," he tells them. "Acknowledgement of our biases, our mistakes, and our power to do better." In the audience, Steve and Brian listen, now part of a new task force focused on community relations and anti-corruption efforts. The city begins healing. New policies are implemented. Community oversight increases. The walls between police and citizens slowly come down, built back as bridges instead of barriers. The final scene shows Steve, Brian, and Elijah meeting in the park where it all began. The same bench, the same streetlights, but everything else has changed. They've moved from adversaries to allies, their shared experience forging an unexpected bond in the pursuit of justice.